"Sir, we need you to move from your accessible table," the staff member said, voice steady but unyielding. Frank, 78, looked up from the spot he'd reserved months earlier. His limp was the quiet mark of a Purple Heart, earned decades ago in service. "This table helps with my injury," he replied, voice low. Still, the staff insisted a young family needed to be together. Without argument, Frank reached for his cane, stood, and made his way to a cramped seat near the kitchen. He settled in, unnoticed by most. But someone in authority was about to change that. The reserved table wasn't just a preference for Frank, it was a necessity. Months before the cruise, he'd submitted his request, careful to explain his need for a seat close to the entrance, with enough space to stretch his injured leg. His left knee still held shrapnel, a reminder of Quang Tri, and standing for more than a few minutes sent pain up his thigh. The reservation confirmation spelled it out in bold: medical accommodation required. That first night, Frank arrived early in his Navy suit, the same one he wore to his granddaughter's commissioning. He took his time lowering himself into the chair, the American flag pin on his lapel catching the chandelier's light. The table was right by the entrance, with enough clearance to let him extend his leg when it stiffened. It was quiet, easy to access, and the linen napkin was folded just the way he liked. A young waiter brought over a bread basket and set it down gently. "Compliments of the chef, sir." Frank nodded but left the bread untouched. He knew better than to eat rich food late, not with his arthritis. He watched the room fill, families shepherding children into seats, older couples finding their places, laughter echoing off the glassware. The dining manager, Danielle, appeared at his side with a clipboard. Her name tag was crisp and formal. "Mr. Delaney?" she asked. "There's a situation with tonight's seating." She nodded toward a couple at the entrance, their 3 children restless, the youngest clutching a stuffed dolphin. Frank's fingers tightened around his cane. "This is my assigned table," he said, his voice steady. Danielle glanced at her clipboard, then back at Frank. "I see your accessibility request," she said, her tone apologetic. "But a family was separated during online check-in, and their children are too young to sit alone." She didn't mention that the staff had already promised the table to the family before reading Frank's medical note. Frank looked at the children, the oldest barely 8. For a moment, he remembered a different time, a different country, and the small sacrifices that had shaped his life. He pushed back his chair, his knee protesting. "Where would you like me to sit?" Danielle gestured to a table near the rear, close to the kitchen entrance. "We've prepared a spot for you there. You'll have a view of the ocean." She didn't mention the noise, or the draft from the swinging doors. Frank collected his cane and napkin. As he left, he caught the father mouthing, "Thank you," to Danielle. No one looked up as Frank made his way to the back of the dining room, his limp pronounced. The bread basket stayed behind, untouched, the butter softening under the warm lights. Frank pushed back from the table using both arms, steadying himself as his knee protested. The effort drew no attention. The dining room's low hum of conversation and clatter of plates covered the small sounds of discomfort. He moved slowly toward his new seat, cane in hand, weaving through a maze of chairs with barely enough room to turn. The carpet near the kitchen was thick, each step requiring extra effort, making his limp more pronounced. The table assigned to him now sat wedged between a service station and an exit, tucked away from the main flow of guests. The space was tight, had to angle his body to fit between the chairs. When he finally sat, his knees pressed against the table's underside. The chair itself was lower than the others, offering little support. It took him a moment to adjust, searching for a position that eased the pressure in his leg. The constant rush of staff reminded him how overlooked he felt. Waiters moved quickly behind him, their conversations about orders and difficult customers drifting over his shoulder. The kitchen doors swung open and shut, letting out bursts of steam and noise. The air near the service station smelled sharply of cleaning chemicals and fish. It was a world away from the quiet, accessible spot he'd reserved. Frank kept his movements deliberate, smoothing his napkin across his lap and aligning his silverware with practiced Korea habit from years of military dining. When a waiter dropped off a menu without a word, Frank didn't bother to open it. He already knew he'd order something simple, a meal that wouldn't aggravate his condition. The noise around him grew as more guests arrived, their laughter and voices filling the space. Across the aisle, a woman watched him. She wore her hair in a neat bun, her posture straight and attentive. Her gaze lingered on the flag pin at Frank's collar and the way he massaged his knee beneath the table. She noticed each time he shifted in his seat, searching for relief from the cramped quarters. The woman took out her phone and began typing. Her message was quick and direct, a note to guest relations, describing an elderly gentleman with a purple heart pin forced to move from accessible seating to a spot by the kitchen. Clearly struggling with mobility, she signed her name and stateroom number, hesitating before sending. Even knowing response times could be slow, she felt compelled to act. She flagged down a passing waiter and quietly requested a glass of the best Cabernet for Frank, instructing the staff not to reveal the sender. When the wine arrived, the waiter simply said it was compliments of the ship. Frank glanced at the glass but pushed it aside. Alcohol didn't mix well with his medication, and he preferred not to risk it. Around him, the dining room carried on guests chatting, silverware clinking, staff moving from table to table. Only a few noticed the quiet man at the edge of the room, adjusting his chair and waiting for his meal. From across the aisle, the woman continued to watch, her nurse's eye noting every small sign of pain. Charlotte Wexler had been an orthopedic nurse for nearly 4 decades before she retired. She didn't need to see medical records to recognize the way Frank moved. His careful adjustment at the table, the subtle flinch as he shifted his weight, the steady grip on his canathes, were familiar signs of a body carrying the long-term burdens of war. She had seen men like him before, soldiers whose injuries lingered long after the uniform was packed away. When staff led Frank to the cramped table near the kitchen, Charlotte noticed every detail, the awkward angle of his leg, the way his shoulders tensed when someone brushed past. She knew the difference between the aches of age and the pain of an old wound. Watching him, she felt a professional obligation to act. She opened the ship's guest app and reported what she'd seen: an elderly passenger, likely a disabled veteran, moved from an accessible table to an unsuitable spot despite a visible medical reservation. She included his name, the details of his discomfort, and a request for immediate review. She attached 2 photos, one of the reserved table with its medical accommodation card, and another of Frank squeezed into his new seat by the kitchen doors. The app gave her a confirmation number, but nothing more. Charlotte wondered if anyone higher up would ever notice, or if her message would get lost among dozens of minor complaints. Somewhere above the dining hall, her report appeared on a guest services screen. A junior staff member read it and flagged Frank's case for temporary review, but no immediate action followed. In the dining room, Frank tried to eat in peace, despite constant interruptions. Usboy nudged his chair. Waiters argued over drink orders right beside him, and a cart rattled past, making him pause mid-bite. He kept his composure, but Charlotte could see the effort it took. As time passed, her complaint made its way through the ship's internal channels. Eventually, it reached the ship's chief medical officer. He recognized the urgency at a glance. Cross-checking Frank's name, he found the record: a veteran with a significant disability rating, prescription for nerve pain, and a Purple Heart. The doctor didn't hesitate. He radioed the dining manager directly, bypassing the usual layers of protocol. The message was clear. The situation needed to be corrected immediately, and a report would be expected before the shift ended. Charlotte watched as Frank quietly declined dessert and folded his napkin, preparing for the long walk back to his cabin. She wondered if the attention of the medical officer would be enough, or if someone with real authority would step in. In the dining room, staff gathered near the service entrance, glancing at printouts and speaking in low voices. Frank's flag pin caught the light as he moved toward the doors, his figure soon lost among the other guests. Up on the bridge, the medical officer's call was about to reach someone with the power to make things right. Captain Reynolds listened as the medical officer explained the situation. He set aside the navigation charts and reviewed the passenger file handed to him by his first officer. The details were clear. Frank Delaney, U.S. Army veteran, Purple Heart, Bronze Star, There was a note from embarkation. Someone had recognized Frank's status during boarding, and his records carried a small veteran's flag sticker. Reynolds closed the folder and paused, his own service still shaping how he handled moments like this. He'd spent over 2 decades in the Navy before moving to civilian ships. His left shoulder bore a scar from service, a quiet reminder beneath his uniform. He straightened his jacket and left the bridge, taking the elevator to Deck 5. When the captain entered the dining hall, the atmosphere shifted, conversations faded, and the usual background clatter softened. Staff exchanged brief, uncertain glances as Reynolds made his way through the room. He moved directly to Frank's table, his steps measured, his presence unmistakable. "Staff Sergeant Delaney?" The captain's voice was calm, carrying just enough for Frank to hear. He stood at attention beside Frank's chair, shoes aligned with the edge of the table. Frank looked up, recognizing the bearing of a fellow career officer. He set down his fork and nodded once. "Captain." Reynolds extended his hand. The gesture was quiet, professional. "Matthew Reynolds, former Navy. I understand we've caused you some inconvenience this evening." His words were direct, free of ceremony. Around them, the dining room was silent. Every eye turned toward the two men. Frank dabbed his mouth with his napkin. "No trouble, Captain. Just hoping for a seat that doesn't make my leg lock up." His tone was matter-of-fact, without complaint. The captain glanced at the cramped space around Frank's chair, noting the proximity to the service station and the constant movement of staff. He nodded once, making a decision. "Your original table is ready, but I'd like to offer you a more suitable option, if you'll allow it." He signaled to the maitre d', who had been waiting nearby. Within moments, a spacious corner table was cleared, set apart from the main flow of traffic, quiet, with ample space for Frank to stretch his leg. The captain pulled out the chair himself as Frank transferred his water glass, the gesture drawing the attention of the entire room. "Dining staff will review how this happened," Reynolds said quietly, adjusting the table to reduce glare from the overhead lights. "But first, I want to make sure you receive the service you deserve." He nodded to the head sommelier, who appeared with a bottle of Bordeaux, a quiet nod to shared experience. Frank gave a small gesture of acknowledgement, the flag pin on his lapel catching the light. The room remained silent, the staff and guests watching the captain's careful attention. Reynolds stepped back, giving Frank the space he needed. He glanced around the dining hall, meeting the eyes of those who had witnessed the exchange. Without another word, he turned toward the front of the room, ready to address everyone present. Captain Reynolds stepped onto the platform at the front of the dining hall. He reached for the microphone, and the faint screech drew every eye in the room. The usual energy faded as guests turned away from their meals to listen. The captain adjusted his hat, the gold braid catching the light, and waited until the room was still. "Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention?" His voice was steady, practiced, and calm. The silence that followed was complete. Only the hum of the ship's engines remained. Even the waitstaff paused at the edges of the room, trays held motionless, watching. Tonight, an administrative error occurred in this dining room. A veteran who served our country was asked to give up his reserved seat because of a mistake. "That's not how we treat those who have served." He spoke plainly, each word measured, his gaze moving across the room before resting on Frank. He continued, "In the military, we learn that looking after your people isn't just a policy, it's a matter of honor." Staff Sergeant Delaney served with the unnoticed Cavalry Division in Vietnam. His accommodations were earned long before he ever boarded this ship. A few heads in the room lifted at the mention of Frank's service. At one table, a man straightened his posture, his hand brushing an empty lapel. A teenager set down his phone, attention fixed on the captain's words. The family seated at Frank's original table sat quietly, the father's hand wrapped tightly around his glass. The captain removed his hat and tucked it under his arm. "The mistake has been corrected, but mistakes deserve acknowledgement. On behalf of this vessel and her crew, I offer both apology and thanks to Staff Sergeant Delaney." His words were simple, direct, and left no room for misunderstanding. He turned toward Frank's table, his movements precise. The dining hall remained silent, the weight of the moment settling over everyone. There was no need for further explanation. The message was clear. As the captain prepared to address Frank directly, the room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would come next. The pause was unbroken. The collective attention of the dining hall focused on a single exchange that would soon define the evening. Captain Reynolds faced Frank, the gold cords on his uniform catching the overhead lights. "Staff Sergeant Delaney," he said, his voice steady and clear. "On behalf of this ship and its crew, I offer you my deepest apologies." Without breaking eye contact, the captain raised his right hand in a formal salute, fingers together, wrists straight, the gesture crisp and unmistakable. The moment was rooted in tradition, but here, in the center of a civilian dining room, it became something more. A public act of respect that acknowledged both the injustice Frank had faced and the value of his service. Frank rose slowly, bracing himself with his cane, his left knee locked and released with a soft pop. He steadied his right hand, the fingers trembling slightly as he returned the salute nod, as rigid as in years past, but unmistakable in its meaning. The purple heart pin on his lapel caught the light, a small but unmissable reminder of what the salute honored. The captain held the salute longer than protocol required, letting the gesture speak for everyone in the room. For a moment, no one moved. Then, as if on cue, the entire dining room rose in support. Applause broke out, not in scattered bursts but as a unified wave that filled the space. Staff at the service doors paused their work to watch. Even those who hadn't witnessed the earlier exchange understood the significance of what was happening. Frank's return salute was not just a response to the captain, it was a reclaiming of dignity. The act transformed what could have been a moment of embarrassment into one of honor. The applause faded, but the respect lingered. The captain lowered his hand and nodded toward Frank's original table, the reserved sign still standing. "Your seat is waiting, sir." The words were simple, but they restored what had been taken. Frank nodded once, a brief gesture that carried the weight of experience. He gathered his cane and napkin, moving with deliberate care back toward his table at the front. As he passed, guests reached out not to stop him, but to offer a silent acknowledgement, a hand resting briefly on his sleeve, a nod, a quiet word of thanks. The family who had taken his table had already moved aside, gathering their things without a word. When Frank reached his seat, the captain was there, pulling out the chair and adjusting it for maximum comfort. The table had been reset, a fresh glass of water and a bottle of wine waiting beside a folded napkin. Frank paused, his hand steadying on the table's edge before he sat. He settled in, his leg comfortably extended, the space around him his once more. The dining room gradually returned to its quiet rhythm, but a sense of respect remained in the air. Waiters moved softly between tables, guests spoke in low voices, and eyes occasionally drifted to Frank, who sat upright at his restored place. As he lifted his spoon to begin his meal, a few guests exchanged glances, the moment still settling in. Before long, a small group approached Frank's table, waiting respectfully until he finished his soup. The family approached with careful steps, their faces marked by a mixture of regret and hope for understanding. The father, younger than Frank by decades, stopped just beside the table, his hand outstretched. "We had no idea, sir, about your service, about any of it," he said, his voice quiet but clear. He shook Frank's hand, his grip uncertain, and looked him in the eye. Behind him, the mother encouraged their children forward, her expression apologetic. The oldest child held out a drawing flag in bold crayon lines, its stars and stripes colored with care and a few gold stickers. "For you," the boy said. The picture was creased and a little smudged, but it was a heartfelt thank you from someone just beginning to understand what it meant to serve. Frank accepted the drawing, studying it for a moment before nodding. "Good hand with the stripes, son," he said, turning it gently so the flag faced the right way. The little girl lingered at her mother's side, her eyes fixed on the medal pinned to Frank's lapel. "Did the captain know you before?" she asked, her voice soft. Frank's mouth twitched. "No, ma'am. He just knows the uniform," he replied, his finger brushing the edge of the pin. The father spoke again, shifting his weight. "They didn't tell us why your table was reserved, just that it was available. We tried to give it back once the captain—" Frank cut him off with a shake of his head. Nothing to fix, he said, his tone gentle but final. Your children should eat where they're comfortable. He folded the drawing along its worn creases and slipped it into his breast pocket beside his handkerchief. The little girl stepped forward and placed a foil-wrapped chocolate beside Frank's water glass. For your dessert, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Frank nodded in thanks, leaving the chocolate untouched. The dining room's noise returned around them. Silverware clinked, conversations picked up, and the spell of the moment faded. The family lingered for a moment longer, the parents exchanging a glance. The mother mouthed a quiet thank you, and the father's shoulders straightened as he guided his children away. They gathered their things from the other table, moving with a subdued air. The children looked back at Frank before following their parents out through the side doors. Frank watched them go, his expression unreadable. He turned back to his meal, his fork moving methodically as he finished what was left. The drawing in his pocket pressed lightly against his chest. The chocolate remained by his glass, its foil reflecting the dining room lights. As the evening wore on, the reserved table near the entrance stood empty, a silent reminder of what had happened. Staff gave it a wide berth, adjusting the silverware but never seating anyone there. Frank sat quietly at his restored place, the noise of the dining room fading into the background. By the time he finished dessert, the room had settled into its usual rhythm. Frank gathered his cane and napkin, pausing for a moment before rising. He took one last look at the chocolate and the empty table before making his way out, the drawing still safe in his pocket. The sense of something changed lingered in the air, even as the staff cleared away the last plates. The following morning, Frank entered the dining room to find his table waiting coffee already poured, a single red rose in a vase. The head waiter greeted him by name and pulled out his chair with a quiet nod. A woman paused on her way out, thanked him for his service, and moved along without lingering. Charlotte passed by, offering a small smile and a folded newspaper, her silent gesture acknowledging the night before. At dinner, the maitre d' led Frank to a larger booth close to the captain's table, the seat cushioned and set apart from the busiest path. A bottle of fine wine from the captain's personal collection rested on ice, the label marked with a handwritten note. The sommelier poured the first glass with quiet ceremony. Staff moved differently around. Frank now busboys slowed as they passed. Waiters described the menu directly, and the bartender remembered his order without being told. These were small shifts, but together they marked a change. Frank was no longer just another face among the guests. Later that week, an envelope arrived at his stateroom with tickets for a VIP shore excursion. The card inside read, "Priority access transport provided. Please present to crew for assistance." Frank hesitated, almost declining, but the adapted vehicle at the gangway made the decision easier. The tour guide, a former Marine, adjusted the microphone volume when Frank mentioned his hearing loss. The little details mattered now. Throughout the ship, people began to recognize Frank. Some nodded as they passed in the corridor. Others stopped to exchange a few words. A group of college students asked for a photo by the pool, explaining their grandfather had served in the same division. The ship's photographer caught Frank mid-laugh one evening, and the image later appeared in the cruise's gallery with a simple caption, "Honoring our veterans." Frank noticed the difference in himself, too. He stood taller at the railings, watching the glaciers. He moved more confidently through the ship, no longer bracing for discomfort or for being overlooked. His cane tapped a steady rhythm across the marble floors. By the time the gala arrived, the other veterans on board had introduced themselves. They traded stories near the piano, laughter carrying across the room. The captain made a point of greeting each of them before dessert. On the final morning, Frank packed his suitcase slowly, folding the child's flag drawing between shirts. The chocolate from the dining room sat on his dresser, untouched. Down at the terminal, a crew member approached with a Navy sweater bearing the ship's logo, the kind reserved for officers. "Captain's orders," the young man said, handing it over before hurrying away. Frank traced the gold stitching with his thumb, then tucked the sweater into his bag. He waited for his shuttle, cane resting across his knees. When the driver opened the door and addressed him as "Sir," Frank didn't hesitate. The sense of being seen and valued lingered, even as the journey home began. A week after returning home, Frank found a thick envelope from the cruise line mixed in with his mail. He almost set it aside with the rest, but the handwritten "personal" in the corner caught his eye. Inside, the letterhead was heavy and formal, the kind companies use when they want to make an impression. The main letter was brief an apology from a customer relations vice president, acknowledging what had happened and offering compensation, discounted future sailings, priority dining, and lifetime upgrades. Frank barely glanced at the list. What mattered was the smaller sheet tucked in behind, written in Captain Reynolds' careful hand. The pen had pressed hard into the page, each word deliberate. "Honor isn't just a word on this ship. Thank you for reminding us." There was a postscript below, the lines slanting slightly. "The Bordeaux we served was from the 71 vintage your tour year, if I recall correctly. My next shipment arrives in August. I'll save a bottle." There was no signature, just the captain's initials in neat block letters. MWR. Frank set the captain's note beside the crayon flag drawing, now flattened under a dictionary on his desk. He found himself tracing the edge of the paper, feeling the grooves where the pen had paused. The contrast between the captain's direct words and the corporate apology was stark. He read the note again, then folded it carefully and slid it into his wallet, behind his Medicare card, where he kept things he didn't want to lose. That afternoon, the phone rang. His granddaughter's voice came through the line, bright and quick. "Grandpa, tell me about the cruise again," she said. Frank shifted the receiver to his better ear and described the dining room, the captain, and the moment he'd been called by name. He left out the details of the salute, but she picked up on the meaning anyway. "Did they at least thank you?" she asked, her voice softer now. Frank glanced at the note on his desk, the handwriting catching the late sun. "Yeah," he said. "They did." Afterward, he made tea and noticed his reflection in the kitchen window. His posture seemed a little straighter, his shoulders less hunched. He tucked the cruise documents away in a drawer knot with his medical files, but with keepsakes and family letters. The captain's note stayed in his wallet, the paper already softening at the corners. That evening, he agreed to march with the color guard at the local Memorial Day ceremony. He chose his old dress blues, the ones with the faded ribbons but sharp creases. The uniform still fit. As he prepared for bed, Frank checked the contents of his desk drawer one more time, finding the cruise line sweater folded neatly beside his discharge papers. The gold thread in the logo glinted under the lamp as he closed the drawer and switched off the light. In the quiet that followed, Frank didn't dwell on the letter or even the applause in the dining room. The captain's words stayed with him, understated but lasting. The story, he thought, would not end there. Charlotte waited 3 days after returning home before writing about what happened on the cruise. She posted the story late at night on her nursing blog, leaving out names and locations, choosing instead to call Frank Veteran X and the cruise company Cruise Line Y. Her focus was on what she'd witnessed. A decorated veteran, quietly giving up his accessible seat, the staff's oversight, and the small details that revealed how easily dignity could be lost or restored. Her regular readers, many of them retired nurses and doctors, shared the post through their networks. By morning, comments had started to appear, some from veterans who recognized the situation, others from people who had seen similar moments go unnoticed. Local news picked up the story before the end of the week. A reporter visited Charlotte's home, filming her as she explained the importance of accessible seating and the ways small mistakes could ripple outward. The segment aired that evening, focusing on the timeline, how Frank had reserved his table, how the staff missed the medical note, and how the situation was finally corrected in front of the entire dining hall. The story spread quickly, first through local channels and then across national news. Frank's granddaughter called from her base, her voice shaky with emotion. She'd seen her grandfather's photo on the news, paired with a clip of the captain's public apology. The story had reached the military community, and now, people who'd never met Frank knew his name. As public attention grew, the cruise line issued a statement, acknowledging the incident and announcing a review of its veteran accommodations policies. They promised to evaluate how staff handled accessibility requests, and to implement clearer protocols for identifying guests with mobility needs. The company's message was brief, but the pressure from veterans organizations and the public was clear. Letters arrived at Frank's home, some from advocacy groups offering to help, others simply expressing gratitude. Local veteran groups invited Frank to speak at meetings, and a nearby VFW added his story to their website, using an old photo of him in uniform. The story's reach extended beyond news segments and online posts. School children sent drawings and thank you notes, and a Korean War veteran mailed Frank a second Purple Heart pin, saying he had one to spare. The cruise line followed up with a formal apology, this time signed by the CEO, outlining new steps to ensure guests with disabilities would not face similar situations in the future. The company also referenced plans to update their training and guest identification procedures, making sure staff would recognize and properly accommodate veterans and others with medical needs. Frank kept most of the letters in a shoebox by his chair, reading them in the quiet hours of the morning. He responded to a few, especially those from younger veterans or families who shared their own stories about service and sacrifice. The attention was unexpected, but it brought a sense of connection he hadn't felt in years. As the days passed, the story faded from headlines, but the changes it set in motion both for the cruise line and for Frank's community remained. With the news cycle moving on, Frank found himself returning to his routine, but the steady arrival of letters and the quiet recognition from his neighbors marked a subtle shift. The world, it seemed, had noticed, and as the next letter slid through his mail slot, Frank understood that some acknowledgments carried more weight than applause or headlines. A government envelope arrived with the morning mail, its weight familiar to Frank after decades of correspondence with the VA. Inside, the letterhead bore the Army Review Board's agency seal. The first line spoke of case reevaluation and historical record correction. Frank read on, eyes narrowing as the language shifted from the impersonal to the specific. A 1,970 field commendation, missed in the shuffle after his evacuation from Quang Tri, had been found and reviewed. He paused at the next paragraph. The Army had reinstated his recommendation for a Silver Star, a medal once downgraded for lack of witnesses. The signature belonged to a general whose name Frank remembered from a long way back. There was a brief handwritten note at the bottom, a simple, "Welcome home." Frank set the letter down, the paper warming in the sunlight that filtered through the porch railings. He watched a neighbor's dog cross the yard, a small reminder of the world moving on outside official records. The letter didn't recount the details show Frank had dragged two men out of the mud, or how his knee had been shattered by a grenade meant for someone else. Those memories lived in the faded photograph on his wall. 8 young men in muddy fatigues, only 3 of whom made it home. Now, after years of silence, the record finally matched the truth he and his squad had carried all this time. Frank placed the letter in the top drawer of his desk, beside the cruise documents and the flag drawing from the dining room. There was a copy of the original commendation request, yellowed and creased, with a line highlighted in bright marker. Conspicuous gallantry. The date stamp showed it had been processed just weeks after the news story about his cruise had spread. The official acknowledgement felt heavy in his hands, but it was the certainty behind it that mattered most. That evening, his granddaughter called from her barracks. The excitement in her voice was clear. Her unit's new training facility would bear the name of Frank's division, and the press release mentioned him by name. In the background, cadets called out greetings, their words echoing across the years. Frank listened, the sound familiar and strange all at once. The next morning, Frank put on his old dress blues for a trip to the VA hospital. The jacket fit, though he noticed the shoulders pulled a bit. He walked through the entrance with a steadier step, his posture different now, as if the years had shifted slightly on his frame. Staff greeted him with a new kind of respect, not out of pity, but with the quiet recognition reserved for those whose stories had finally been told. At home, Frank sat on his porch as the sun dipped below the trees. The letter from the Army rested on his lap, creased and reread, its words simple but lasting. He didn't need the medal itself. What mattered was that the record official archivano reflected the reality he and his brothers in arms had always known. The truth hadn't changed, only its place in the world. As dusk settled, Frank listened to the quiet of his street, the voices of neighbors drifting through open windows. The acknowledgement in that envelope was more than a correction. It was a restoration, a small light held up against years of silence. And as he watched the evening deepen, he understood that some legacies are built not only on what is remembered, but on what is finally set right. Frank's quiet sacrifice in the dining room began with a simple act, giving up his seat, without complaint. The captain's salute and the applause that followed did more than correct a mistake. They restored a sense of dignity that often goes unnoticed. These gestures, though small, carried weight and set off a ripple of respect that reached far beyond that evening at sea. Not every veteran's story ends with medals or ceremonies. Sometimes it's a single moment of public recognition that makes all the difference. If you see a veteran today, pause and say thank you. Small gestures honor profound service.